tabloid in Boca Raton, Florida. It's a subsidiary of American Media Incorporated. Ever since the attacks on the Twin Towers, things at the office have been incredibly hectic. Bob had to stay late at the office last night, even though they needed to get on the road early this morning. Right now, they're on their way from Florida to Charlotte, North Carolina to visit their daughter. It's a long drive, 10 hours, but it's good for Bob to get out of the office. They reach Charlotte by Friday, September 28th, and pick up their daughter. Then they hit the road again on Saturday, heading to Chimney Rock State Park for some hiking. Maureen notices Bob seems tired, which isn't necessarily surprising. He's been working hard, and he's 63. Hiking isn't as easy as it used to be, but her concern grows that night, when Bob skips dinner and goes to bed early. The next day is Sunday, and Bob still isn't feeling great. He has chills, exhaustion, and nausea. Even so, Bob drives them all the way home the next day. When they get back to Florida that night, Bob's fever has gone up. He seems disoriented. Really early in the morning, basically the middle of the night, he jolts awake and throws up. Maureen decides to take him to the hospital. At 2 a.m., Maureen drops Bob off at the ER. She heads home for a few hours and returns at 8 a.m. She's likely expecting to get some answers about what's going on. But what she learns is shocking. While Maureen was gone, Bob had a seizure and fell into a coma. The hospital has no idea what's wrong with him. They're concerned about how fast his health declined. According to David Willman's book, The Mirage Man, 5 hours after Bob is admitted, his organs have shut down. His lymph nodes are swollen, and CT scans show his chest is inflamed. There's some talk of meningitis or pneumonia, which can both cause fever, confusion, and vomiting, but those diagnoses don't quite fit Bob's symptoms. The hospital enlists an infectious disease specialist, Dr. Larry M. Bush, to help make sense of it all. Bush examines the scans and draws cerebrospinal fluid from Bob's spine. That's when he notices something strange. The fluid is cloudy. It definitely shouldn't be. Maureen stands at Bob's bedside, horrified and confused. She spends the rest of the morning pressing doctors for information until she finally goes home to wait for more news. Shortly before 2 p.m., Maureen gets a call from the hospital. They tell her Bob tested positive for anthrax. Okay, but what exactly is anthrax, you're probably wondering? To give you a brief overview, anthrax is a disease caused by a bacteria usually found in soil. It's not contagious. Most commonly, it's contracted when the bacteria gets in a cut or wound. This causes cutaneous anthrax, which is most often seen in people who work with livestock. It's curable with a survival rate of almost 100% if treated correctly. But there's the more serious inhalational anthrax. It's caused when someone breathes in spores formed by those same bacteria. So the particles causing the disease are the same, but the way they enter the body is different. Some of the initial symptoms of inhalational anthrax can mimic a cold or pneumonia, like developing a cough or breathing problems. But eventually, lesions form on the lungs. The bacteria can spread to the brain and cause lesions there too. It's a horrible way to die. According to an article in The Atlantic, quote, as their minds disintegrate, victims literally drown in their own fluids. With treatment, inhalational anthrax has a 55% survival rate. Without treatment, almost everyone who contracts it will die. Maureen asks Dr. Bush a hard question. Something along the lines of, is Bob going to survive this? He tells her there's a chance her husband will be okay. But privately, Dr. Bush is probably more worried than he's letting on. Bob Stevens has inhalational anthrax, the more severe form of the disease. And it's incredibly rare. He's the first known case in the US in 25 years, since 1976. There also isn't an obvious place he could have gotten it. He doesn't work with livestock and doesn't live in an area where he'd be exposed to something in the environment. So the first, most pressing question is, where on earth did it come from? A clue comes 2 days later, when 73-year-old Ernesto Blanco is receiving medical treatment in Miami, Florida. He's also experiencing fatigue and trouble breathing. He soon becomes weak and confused. It feels really similar to Bob. The same symptoms, the quick decline, the severity. And it just so happens that Ernesto distributes mail at the American media offices in Boca Raton, the same place Bob works. He started feeling sick the day after the Stevens family left for vacation. Ernesto is put on a respirator and spends the next few weeks fighting for his life. Tubes work overtime, draining fluids from his lungs as he loses weight at an alarming clip. Doctors aren't sure he's going to live. Ernesto isn't sure he's going to live. But eventually, he turns a corner. He improves. 3 weeks after he's admitted, he's cleared to go back home. His recovery is amazing to doctors, since inhalational anthrax is often deadly at such a late stage. Not everyone is so lucky. On October 5th, Maureen's worst fears are realized. Her husband, Bob Stevens, dies. It's devastating for his family, who are left grief-stricken and baffled. The suddenness is hard to wrap their heads around, especially for Maureen. They were just on a family vacation a few days ago. Bob hiked, he laughed, he drove her home. Now he's gone, and no one can tell her why. The doctors at the hospital are just as confused. So is the Florida Health Department, and the infectious disease experts, and the FBI, and the CDC. Because at this point, authorities have heard about Bob's anthrax diagnosis and Ernesto Blanco's symptoms. They're worried. If the anthrax bacteria is lingering somewhere out there, in the environment or in a batch of contaminated animal products, that means more people could come in contact with it. So they need to confirm where the men were exposed. Investigators from the FBI and CDC follow the route Bob took from Florida to North Carolina and back, swabbing whatever surfaces he might have come into contact with. Finally, they descend on the American media offices in Boca Raton. This is the most obvious place to look, considering it's the common link between Ernesto and Bob. Members of a hazmat team get to work gathering samples from all over the office. As soon as they wrap up the next morning, they send the swabs for testing. 2 samples from Bob's office test positive for anthrax. They came from his keyboard and mailbox. Ernesto's illness makes more sense now. He's in charge of mail distribution. If he delivered a contaminated letter to Bob, that would explain the anthrax in the mailbox and why both men got sick. But no one can find the offending letter. Probably because American media doesn't ship its trash to a landfill where investigators can search for it. It uses an incinerator. That means a key piece of evidence has, quite literally, gone up in flames. One mystery is solved. The investigators know where Bob and Ernesto got sick, but 1,000 others remain. The most pressing of which is still, how did the spores get there? I'm repeating myself here, but remember, anthrax has appeared in the United States for the first time in 25 years. It killed someone who had no proximity to obvious sources of the bacteria. The most likely scenario is that this anthrax isn't naturally occurring, but rather grown in a lab. It means someone did this on purpose. Still, the government suggests it's an isolated incident. There's no evidence of terrorism, so there isn't a need to worry. But a few days after Bob Stevens dies, a new development proves them wrong.
Stand out from the crowd with training from Universal Technical Institute. As an official training partner for top brands worldwide, UTI has relationships with some of the nation's top brands, like BMW, Ford, Freightliner, and more. No matter your passion in transportation, skilled trades, or energy, we have 15 training options for you, and with $15 million in scholarships and grants available this year to those who qualify, there's never been a better time to get started. Visit uti.edu today.
It's me, Emma Chamberlain, the host of the Anything Goes podcast with exclusive video episodes on Spotify. On my show, I talk about whatever's on my mind, and I occasionally interview some people to hear what's on theirs. I've talked about a lot of things. The internet, social media, fashion, and everything in between. You name it. Nothing's off limits. Anything goes on Anything Goes. Follow Anything Goes on Spotify to get new episodes every Thursday and Sunday.
An assistant to NBC News anchor Tom Brokaw has contracted a skin form of anthrax after opening a suspicious letter.
That's Lauren Frayer, an Associated Press correspondent. It's October 12, 2001, and she's breaking the news that there's been another anthrax poisoning in New York. Tom Brokaw's assistant, Aaron O'Connor, opened a letter containing white powder several days earlier. A sore formed on her skin, then turned into a blackened lesion. She goes to the doctor for a biopsy. While waiting for results, O'Connor is given Cipro, an antibiotic that fights anthrax infections. It's a precaution at the time, but it turns out to be a good move. The biopsy comes back positive for cutaneous anthrax. It's terrifying, but O'Connor caught it early, and the cutaneous form of anthrax is highly treatable. She'll be okay. Plus, this time the FBI found the letter that poisoned her, which makes it seem even more likely the anthrax is traveling by mail. But the evidence also makes the situation feel more dire. The envelope O'Connor opened is addressed to Tom Brokaw. It has capitalized letters written at a sloping angle across the front and no return address. Inside is a photocopied piece of paper that says 9/11/01. This is next. Take penicillin now. Death to America. Death to Israel. Allah is great. The mention of the date, 9/11, is scary. It suggests the perpetrators of those attacks, the extremist group known as Al-Qaeda, might have something to do with this too. Immediately, it feels like the terror America experienced last month isn't over. When I got back to New York after the attacks, I was taking the subway one day in from Brooklyn to New York, and a woman grabbed my hand as we were going underground, and we held hands the whole.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Spectrum Business, made to work just like your small business. Fast, reliable internet, phone, and mobile services made to keep up with demand and made to deliver on a small business budget. Discover more at spectrum.com/work.
You're listening to Shortwave from NPR. In 1859, an English scientist named Richard Carrington spent much of his time watching the sun's activity. And in September of that year, he noticed something next to a large sunspot, one of those dark areas on the sun's surface.
He saw a really big flash, and he wasn't sure what happened.
Dr. Samaya Fareed is a solar physicist at Yale University.
He thought there was some kind of accident with the instrument or something like that.
Less than a day later, on the other side of the world, a group of gold miners in the Rockies woke up to what they thought was the sunrise.
Come out the tents, and people have started, going about the day, and they realize, wait, the sun is not rising. This is actually just an aurora.
They were seeing the aurora borealis, the northern lights, This aurora was so huge it was witnessed in places where it's rarely seen, like Cuba. This event even caused strong southern lights in places like Chile and Colombia. And it was doing weird things to the technology of the era. Telegraph machines sparked, shocking operators, catching the telegraph paper on fire, and some of the machines stopped working completely. And in one case, an unplugged telegraph machine continued operating, powered by a rogue current in the atmosphere. What Richard Carrington observed that day taught us a lot about the sun and space weather.
People knew about the aurora, but they didn't know it was related to the sun. So he was the first person to kind of correlate the two.
Right now, the sun is at its maximum within an 11-year solar cycle. This means lots of activity will happen on the surface of the sun over the next few months. That could affect us here on Earth. So today on the show, we revisit a story about this nearest star. We learn about what's happening on the surface of the sun and what may happen the next time a massive solar storm, like the one in 1859, hits Earth. I'm Regina Barber, and you're listening to Shortwave from NPR.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Spectrum Business, made to work just like your small business. Fast, reliable internet, phone, and mobile services, made to keep up with demand and made to deliver on a small business budget. Discover more at spectrum.com/work. This message comes from NPR sponsor Noom. Noom Med is a healthcare program that can help you overcome your body's biological barriers to weight loss. The program helps you understand the psychology behind your eating choices and why you have cravings. See if you qualify today at noom.com/med. That's NOOM.com/MED.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Solgar. As people age, cellular function declines, which may impact changes in energy and strength. Solgar Cellular Nutrition is a holistic collection of cellular nutrients formulated to help fight cellular decline and promote cell health. Learn more at cellularnutrition.solgar.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
A geomagnetic storm happens when the Earth's magnetic field fluctuates. It changes. It can be generated from the sun's activity. But to understand this huge 1859 solar storm called the Carrington event, we need to understand two other things. First, solar flares. Solar flares are caused by a sudden release of high-energy photons, which are particles of light, and other high-energy particles from the sun's atmosphere.
That's kind of the largest type of eruptive event on the sun.
Solar flares release an explosion of mostly electromagnetic radiation. Some of them are white light flares. The photons that white light flares release are in the visible portion of the electromagnetic or light spectrum. But sometimes these eruptions also send matter toward Earth.
It releases sometimes a CME, which is a coronal mass ejection.
These coronal mass ejections, or CMEs, blast hot plasma, superheated gas, from the sun into space at more than 1 million miles per hour.
So the flare is like the bomb going off, and then the CME is like the rocks and the particles and the
Like
waves.
a chunk of the sun coming at us.
Right, exactly. So yeah, it's two. Sometimes you can have a flare without a CME, and sometimes you can have a CME without a flare, but they're very also highly correlated to each other. So a lot of times when you have a flare, you also have a CME.
Okay, so solar flares are large explosions of electromagnetic radiation from the sun's atmosphere, and you're saying they're sometimes accompanied by these coronal mass ejections, or these CMEs, which are huge plasma eruptions from the sun. So can you tell our listeners, how do these auroras even happen? How do northern lights happen?
So a lot of people think that the particles that are causing the aurora are coming from the sun, and they do kind of indirectly, but really we have the Earth in a magnetic field, and it's already particles inside of that magnetic field, the Earth just sitting there. And so when those particles and radiation come from the sun in a CME, it interacts with the Earth's magnetic field, causes it to push around all its particles, and to push those particles down inside of the Earth's atmosphere, and that's what you see as the aurora.
Right, you're seeing these particles colliding with the hydrogen and nitrogen in the atmosphere. So what do we think happened in the 1859 solar storm, the Carrington event? Did we see a flare and a CME?
Yep, so we had a CME that happened before the Carrington event. That one didn't have as much impact on Earth, but people did notice some aurora. And then this flare, white light flare, which means that it was observed in white light and then the CME that followed that one is what caused a lot of the disruption on Earth.
And not only are we having charged particles coming into our magnetic field, but we're also having a changing magnetic field. And when you have a changing magnetic field, you induce electricity. So that's another reason why those telegraph wires in 1859.
Exactly. It's overload of electricity generated just from those moving magnetic fields moving quickly and generating electricity, which is nuts.
It is, right? Okay. So what brings us to, like, because you have Earth's magnetic field changing, your energy grids are getting, like, busted. So, like, what would happen if we had a storm like that now?
Yeah, it's estimated that that kind of event right now will be catastrophic across the globe. That means no internet, no phone, no TV, and no power. And not just that, even like water cleaning systems and health systems, all those things could be potentially wiped out. Anything with an electrical circuit could be potentially destroyed. You know, some people have estimated it would take us years to recover, 10 years to recover from one storm like that.
So has anything come close to a Carrington event in recent years?
We have, but did not impact the Earth. But we have seen white flares that were the size of the Carrington event. You know, it would have been very impactful if they had been directly aimed at Earth.
These huge events, how often do they happen?
Well, so the sun goes through a solar cycle that happens every 11 years when we go from having a lot of flares at solar maximum to not that many flares in solar minimum. But that large Carrington event type storm, a lot of people think only happen, you know, once every 10 years at least to 100 years. It depends on which estimation.
And the Carrington event happened way back in 1859, so we're overdue.
Past due for one, definitely, by any estimation.
Makes me think of like the big earthquake in Seattle. They're like any day now.
Yeah, exactly. It's like any day.
Any day. But so what are we doing then? Like, what are we doing to prepare if these events are coming?
Yeah, so I know that there's a council that has been set up that is a collaboration between all the agencies like National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Science Foundation, and then NASA, and Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security. So I believe that organization is called SWARM, Space Weather Operations Research and Mitigation. And so what it does is develop a strategy and a plan to implement how to prevent having such a catastrophic effect on the electrical system, and then what to do after that kind of event.
So let's say there's even smaller storms, you know, like how much time do we have? What would that warning be like?
Yeah, so if we have a big, large flare, it's pretty much immediate. 8 minutes is how much time it takes energy to travel from the sun to the earth, which is dangerous because, you know, astronauts and the commercial private space industry is booming now. Also, high altitude flights would be really effective because you can get extra radiation exposure. So that's almost immediate. That's 8 minutes. We don't have very much warning at all. But for the CMEs, for the particles that are coming with the CME, we have about 2 or 3 days warning.
Okay. These coronal mass ejections, they're composed of matter, right? So they're moving super fast, but they're not traveling at the speed of light. So we have more time than a flare. That sounds better.
Slightly better, you know. And we do have now, we have observatories that observe the sun 24/7. Solar Dynamics Observatory is one of them, and it takes images of the sun every 12 seconds of the whole corona. And so if a flare goes off then, or if we see even a configuration that might cause a flare, they often will put out a flare alert.
What do the astronauts do? What do satellites do? Like, what do they do to prepare?
Yeah, so they have a safety plan. So for instance, the astronauts have a room on board the International Space Station that have denser walls to protect them from radiation. So they will all go into those rooms. And for satellites that are orbiting the Earth, the plan is for them to turn their electronics away from the sun so that they can miss the highest energy particles. They do have a contingency plan, you know, for these type of things, but it's hard to exactly to predict. But they do have a plan.
So the radiation from solar flares can cause problems high in the atmosphere, and we know that here on Earth that CMEs can destroy.
How may I help you?
I have a mobile order.
Mobile?
SX78.
Russell?
Yep.
Pull up the second window. How can I?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Oh, I guess I could go to the second window. That's weird. starving now. I'll pick a spot to park. Right here. So the car is fine? No?
Yeah, it ran fine. I don't know.
So how did it get to 50?
Because the gauge is the older gauge. So I stopped at the Banner Exxon station and the air meter or whatever. And I guess that I should have stopped a little bit before or something.
50, man, I could have blew up.
In a parking lot in Robeson County, North Carolina, Carissa Collins Cattle is hustling, handing out health supplies to drug users.
Did you overdose when you got home? Damn, girl, most people do.
Carissa is in drug recovery herself, sober 9 years. And on this crisp morning in December, she's working for a non-profit, helping people addicted to drugs, including fentanyl. Our colleague Julie Wernow recently traveled to go meet with her.
Carissa is like everybody's Southern mama. Like, this woman is smoking constantly, swears when she needs to, hugs freely.
You don't need no kids.
No. What about wound care?
And she goes around this big county in North Carolina handing out all kinds of supplies for people who use drugs.
Carissa has been doing this work for several years. But a couple years ago, something strange started happening. Drug users were getting these horrible wounds, unlike anything they'd seen before. It was like their flesh was rotting. Looking for help, they started texting Carissa.
And then the next thing that happens is she starts to get these photos.
Carissa showed some of them to Julie.
Is that her leg? Her arm. Her arm. Like, right here.
Like, drug users that she works with were sending her photos of these wounds and saying, "What is this? I've never had this before." In some cases, people were looking at things that had started as something that looked like a cigarette burn and had blown up to the size of a grapefruit on their arms.
Some wounds were so deep that people's bones and tendons were exposed.
I've never seen anything like it.
In a lot of cases, people think they're just taking fentanyl. But fentanyl doesn't cause wounds like this. Instead, they're actually being caused by a different drug. A drug that's getting mixed into the supply. It's a sedative called xylazine, also known as Tranq. And as this new drug sweeps across the country, Carissa's watching it ravage her community.
Personally, to me, it's scarier than fentanyl. We know what to do with opioids. We know what drug works to reverse opioid withdrawals. We have no damn idea about how to treat xylazine.
Welcome to The Journal, our show about money, business, and power. I'm Ryan Knudsen. It's Wednesday, February 21st. Coming up on chapter in the opioid crisis.
This episode is brought to you by ExxonMobil. The world needs ways to reduce carbon emissions. ExxonMobil is working on solutions in its own operations, like carbon capture and clean energy from hydrogen that could also help other businesses, like manufacturing, commercial transportation, and power generation, helping deliver heavy industry with low emissions. Find out more at exxonmobil.com.
This new addictive drug that's infiltrating the opioid supply, xylazine, was never meant for humans. Julie's been covering its rise for months.
So xylazine is an animal tranquilizer. Some people call it trank, and there's a lot we don't know about it. It's the kind of thing that you'd use to put down a horse, tranquilize it.
Illegal drug makers try out lots of different additives to see if they can make opioids like fentanyl more potent or cheaper to make. And xylazine, or trank, check those boxes.
So you get the sense that there is a little bit of drug manufacturers throwing spaghetti at a wall and seeing what works, what's cheapest, what's most powerful, what will keep people coming back in the way that any big business would do with any product, right? But in this case, it's killing people.
Xylazine is not an opioid like fentanyl. It's a sedative.
It's not meant for human consumption, so there's really not very much known about what it does to humans. It's always been legal. It's something that, people could buy online.
Philadelphia was the first big hotspot for xylazine. But late last year, the Drug Enforcement Administration said xylazine samples were turning up all over the place.
They said that it's actually present in all the states almost in the entire country, very quickly. So I wanted to know where it had just emerged, where it was the worst, and go to that place and see how they were managing. I got in touch with a company that tests the urine samples of drug users, and they pointed me to North Carolina. This one county, Robeson, was ground zero.
That's where Julie spent time with Carissa Collins Cattle, the chain-smoking Southern mama you heard from earlier. Robeson County is about 1,000 square miles, much of it rural farmland. The county is ranked among the least healthy counties in North Carolina, and it was hit hard by the opioid crisis.
One thing I want to say about Robeson is that you don't go there and immediately see there's any drug problem. There's not people sprawled out on the streets. The drug use there just happens in homes at the ends of these long driveways where people don't even have a car to drive on their driveways because of how much poverty there is. So a lot of this is hidden.
Now, where are we now?
Okay, so Carissa's driving me all around the county, and her phone just keeps blowing up. It's people texting her, looking for supplies, drug users who are looking for a visit.
One person texting her was Ashley Locklear. She's 27, and she's been getting wounds from xylazine. Julie and Carissa went to go see her.
We pulled up to Ashley's house where she lives with her mom, Kelly. Her mom's saying to her, show Carissa, show her what's going on with you.
My mama tell you, it's been 2 days now. I've been up and looking. My leg get better. It ain't getting better.
Ashley came outside in her bathrobe and pajamas. She lifts up one leg of her pajama pants, and it's like the surface of the moon.
Yeah, it's just getting bigger and bigger. And like I said, now I wasn't having no problems with my hands, and now I'm having.
And she's smoking like it's her last cigarette and telling Carissa how badly it hurts. And her mom's in the background saying, I don't want to lose my baby. I can't lose my baby.
She's running her life. She's made some bad mistakes. She made some bad choices, but she's still not going to love her.
Ashley was 13 years old when a doctor gave her opioids for a broken foot. For years, she was prescribed those pills and became dependent.
A new doctor came, cut her off those drugs, and she had intense withdrawal for the first time in her life and turned to the illicit market.
Ashley went from heroin to fentanyl, and now she's also addicted to xylazine.
And her other leg she won't show us because she has a compression sock on it to try what she thinks might keep it from hurting, but it hurts so bad, she says, that when the dogs brush up against her leg, it feels like knives.
Oh, man. What was Carissa's reaction when she saw it?
Love and kindness, just saying, trying to gently coax her into the idea that she might need care from a hospital.
But Ashley didn't want to go.
Yeah, no, that's anything. I'm procrastinating about it. You know what I mean? It's like...
Why is she so afraid to go to the hospital?
Because she's had bad experiences at the hospital. She's been treated like someone who just needs to kind of straighten up and fly right. Her withdrawal symptoms have been ignored or not taken care of. So there's trauma there from visiting hospitals, and then now on top of that, she has this new kind of withdrawal from xylazine. I would say she's also afraid that she's going to lose her leg.
Xylazine users sometimes lose so much flesh to rot that their limbs have to be amputated. Later that day, Julie checked back in and asked if Ashley was heading to the hospital. Ashley's mom, Kelly, texted back, "We're not gonna make it," she wrote. "She's high and I can't get her up." The wounds from xylazine are one thing, but there are other big concerns, like how life-saving drugs like Narcan don't seem to work as well. Xylazine is baffling hospitals.
There's so much they still don't know about it. Xylazine has just made everything so much more complicated. People feel like they're back to square one, and there's a lot of reasons why.
That's next.
This episode is brought to you by Empower. If you're like most people, you've had your fair share of financial questions. Questions like, will you be able to afford a third kid? Will you be able to do everything you want when you retire? What if you outlive your savings? Empower knows these questions can be stressful, so they're here to help answer your what-ifs and empower what's next. Join 18 million Americans and take control of your financial future. Tap the banner to learn more or visit empower.com.
You've seen the headlines. Bonds are making a comeback. But if you've ever tried to invest in bonds, you know what a clunky, complicated, broken experience it can be. That's why at Public, we took fixed income and fixed it. Now you can find, evaluate, and buy thousands of bonds with an investing experience designed this century.